Fantasy is a huge and very popular genre, and there are literally thousands of fantasy movies that you can watch. But therein lies the problem, because there are also many different fantasy subgenres. There's urban fantasy, fantasy romance, paranormal fantasy, and yes, even sci-fi fantasy. How to make sense of it all? How do you make a proper choice if you want to watch a fantasy film right now? Well, the easiest way to navigate between all those subgenres is just by looking at where the story is set. In other words, find out whether a movie is high fantasy or low fantasy. Basically, high fantasy is any story set in its own unique world. It must be a universe that's separate from our own. If it's clearly not the real world, and it's filled with weird creatures, gods, magic, and other stuff that definitely isn't part of everyday life, then you have a high fantasy film. High fantasy films and books also have their own history and mythology, and most importantly, maps. These made-up worlds all have complex backstories, and that's a big part of what makes this subgenre so cool. A great example of a common type of high fantasy story is fairy tales, not to mention mythology, like the Norse gods or the pantheons of ancient Greece and Rome. Another high fantasy world would be Star Wars. Typically, people match Star Wars up with sci-fi rather than high fantasy, but no. Jedi use space magic, and all those worlds in a galaxy far away are filled with bizarre creatures. There's no Earth in sight, and the rules of physics and nature are not the same as our own. The 2014 adventure epic Seventh Son is a very high fantasy film. The black and white take on themes like good versus evil, combined with a healthy dose of adventure, works out great. Lead actor Ben Barnes thought that was one of the best things about the project.
You know, it's so much fun to do all the training and all the physical stuff. It's great fun, but also I thought this one in particular had some, you know, I've read a lot of other fantasy stuff in between Narnia, and this isn't the first one I could have done, you know, but it just seemed to have a really good hold on its themes about the good and evil inside of everyone, and whether anything we do in life is kind of predestined, or whether we have sort of freedom of choice.
The works of J.R.R. Tolkien, especially The Lord of the Rings, are regarded as archetypal works of high fantasy. Although, an interesting debate can ensue if you consider Tolkien's own words about the origins of Middle-earth. He said it all takes place in the far distant prehistory of Earth itself. So, low fantasy, right? Wrong. Despite his claims, it doesn't show any actual resemblance to our real world, and therefore is straight-up high fantasy. By contrast, low fantasy is a combination of the real world with fantasy elements. It takes real places and histories that we're quite familiar with and intertwines them with fantastical elements that totally change everything we thought we knew. Twilight is a very popular example of low fantasy, as is Conan the Barbarian, and anything from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of these, well, most of the Marvel movies anyway, are set on Earth, but introduce some form of fantasy. You'll know them the second you see them. Vampires, monsters, Thor's hammer. If high fantasy is a new and epic world, low fantasy is the world which we know, but a version that's populated by a finite number of things that aren't what we'd consider normal. High fantasy and low fantasy differ in that one is entirely out of someone's imagination, and the other is taking some new ideas and combining them with reality. Both have exciting options for storytelling, and both are insanely popular brands of fiction. Visual effects specialist Ken McGow has been involved in many high fantasy movies, like The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, Mortal Engines, and Avatar: The Way of Water. He knows better than anyone that there are only two things you need if you want to make a high fantasy film look realistic.
Time and money. There is a saying, whenever a producer says, "Can you do this?" we say, "Well, give us enough money, enough time, sure we can." It's very labor intensive, and most of the developments in the future are going to be making it less labor intensive. Because I think we feel like we can achieve almost anything visually that we want to at this point, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy.
Well, that's excellent news for us movie fans, because it means we get to see epic films that are set in a completely made-up world and that look super convincing, and that's always a good thing. The problem with the difference between high and low fantasy is that the vast majority of books or films or games have both high and low fantasy elements in them. So in the end, it's still very hard to make a clear distinction between those two extremes. And that's fine, Because as long as Hollywood keeps making awesome fantasy movies, the audience is still the real winner, whether they like high or low fantasy, or both.